We live in a new world. The LGBTQ legislative struggles, the Me Too movement, and Black Lives Matter have borne sweeping changes across the US. Many more Americans today have participated in public demonstrations, and we've seen clashes between federal, state, and local authorities in dealing with the movement. How is this translating into the workplace? Well, that's today's show. I'm Lisa Smith, and this is Focus on Business.
Hi, I'm Scott Lyon. I'm Senior Vice President for the Small Business Association of Michigan. Thank you for tuning in to our television show. I'd like to spend the next few minutes talking to you about our new relationship with AHOLA Payroll and Human Capital Management. First, I want to say one thing. AHOLA is a small business itself. They have 60 employees, and while they're small in size, the tools that they bring to our members are very much on par with that of the big national payroll players. How do I know that? I know that for a couple of reasons. Before SBAM puts its name on any product or service, there's a vetting process that goes through. It's a vetting process to make sure that whatever, first off, that company is telling us is absolutely 100% true, to make sure that the product, the service is appropriate for small business, and to make sure that we're going to be proud of the products, the partners that bring those products, and everything to you as a small business owner. The second reason I know that is because at SBAM, we use AHOLA to process the payroll for our own staff. AHOLA processes payroll for literally thousands of small companies across the country along with their employees. So they get it both as a small business and as a vendor partner to many, many small businesses across the country. Their tools are as good, or in many respects better, than the big national payroll players. They'll give you a single point of contact, and they'll do it right, and they'll do it for a very competitive price. So if you're interested, please call Chad Husson on the SBAM team. You can reach Chad at 517-267-2219 or email by chad, C-H-A-D, HUSON@sbam.org. Or you can just jump on our website at www.sbam.org/payroll and get a whole lot more information. Thanks for your time and attention. And if you have questions, you know where to find us.
We're talking today with Jocelyn Giangrande, a nationally known Cornell certified diversity and inclusion expert. Jocelyn, you are from Southeast Michigan. Welcome to the show. Can you tell us about what you do?
Absolutely. Thank you, Lisa, for having me. Yes, I am a diversity expert and consultant, and I've been doing diversity and inclusion work for over 25 years. And what I really see myself as doing is I coined myself as a diversity and inclusion leader who's strategic, who knows the difference between doing diversity and building a culture that embraces it. And so basically what I do is I help organizations take the mystery out of launching a diversity and inclusion strategy, helping them craft their vision around diversity and inclusion, and then also proper sequencing in terms of implementing that strategy. I also help them train and educate their workforce in the communities that they serve around awareness, sensitivity, and building a respectful workplace. But then at the end of the day, what I really do is help organizations take a holistic approach to cultural transformations.
Well, we're so lucky to have you. Your list of awards and accolades is far too numerous to really read off, but it's very impressive. And some of the organizations that you've worked with are also as impressive. So thank you for spending some time. I want to talk a little bit, just very quickly, This is a little bit different of a window of time than we've been in. Diversity, equity, and inclusion have been around for a long time. What if a company says, you know what, we want to start afresh, but we want to get off on the right track?
Yes, Lisa, that's a number one question that I've been getting lately. When organizations have reached out to me, they have been asking, we know that things are changed in the country, or actually even globally, in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what should we be doing now? That is the number one question. And so what I have been informing organizations is to go back to the basics. I think in times of crisis, in which we are in a mini crisis, I think right now in the economic climate, but also in the racial injustice climate as well, is to go back to the basics. And I always say, start with getting to know your people. And it sounds simple, but I think it is a huge step. Creating an environment that is safe, where people feel comfortable speaking candidly about what does it feel like to work in your organizational culture, getting to know the people in terms of what their aspirations, their values, even them personally, is really important. So taking that time, I think where we get so busy, we're doing a lot more with less, we forget that we have people working for us. And so getting to know them, getting to understand them is a huge step. The other part is looking at opportunities to train and educate. I think the way organizations has been functioning from an inclusive culture standpoint, well, those expectations have changed literally overnight. And I think your workforce, you're going to find, is a little bit more empowered to hold you accountable to an inclusive culture. So looking for opportunities to train and educate around implicit bias, around what does it mean, the difference between diversity and inclusion, and then also how to heighten the level of awareness and sensitivity amongst different groups, particularly around your leadership. And then lastly, I would say most organizations have recommitted to diversity and inclusion by putting out statements, redefining what does it mean in terms of a definition for diversity in their organizations. And so now I think the important part is to put some action behind those words. So how are you going to demonstrate that commitment? How are you going to live up to it? And that's what most of the communities internally and externally are looking for, the action behind the words, the credibility behind those statements. So I say get back to the basics, get to know your people, train and educate, and then figure out how you're going to demonstrate that commitment.
And this is not a line in your policy or your employee handbook. If this is important to you, things that are important take work. And work is hard. It takes time. People, when you pay attention to something, it takes time. So that commitment, no, it's not really simply just something that simple. You mentioned, Jocelyn, implicit bias, and we hear that term a lot, but I want to spend a little bit of time on it because it's important to understand what that means. And what does it mean in the workforce?
Absolutely. Well, implicit bias, or sometimes people call it unconscious bias, or those are terms that you can use interchangeably, and I do at times as well. And I think it's important to define what an implicit or an unconscious bias is. If you're looking at the traditional formal definition of implicit bias, it's really a prejudice or a preference for or against an individual or group or situation. And when I do my trainings, which actually my implicit bias training is one of my most popular, particularly around this time, I boil that definition down even further. And I say that a bias is really a shortcut to a decision. And so what happens is that we make decisions very quickly. In fact, they say we make decisions about a quarter of a second. And so what happens is our biases allow us to skip over more information. And so that information that we skip over it could actually be really credible information, but we skip over it by relying on our cultural lens, the stereotypes that we have about individuals or situations, and then also our view of self. And so it is important, particularly now more so than ever, to focus on the impact that our implicit biases have on our decisions, our perceptions, and our interactions. And particularly for those who are in leadership positions who have the authority to make decisions, because we rely on our biases. And the interesting thing is that our biases play out at an unconscious level. So they are triggered automatically without our awareness. And the other thing about biases that I think is important to point out is the fact that nice people are biased too. And in fact, we're all biased. In the training that I actually conduct, it's titled, If You're Human, You're Biased. And so I think it's important for organizations to focus on that because they play out so much and they can impact people's lives, their opportunities for advancement, whether they're selected for a position or not, whether they're tapped for development, and how you perceive their performance. And so they play out in a lot of our everyday activities in the workplace.
So you mentioned that nice people also have bias.
Yes.
What about really smart people or very successful people? Does intelligence then breathe out, allow you to shed that?
Well, that's interesting because our view of self plays a major role, and it is one of the 3 building blocks to biases. And so, in fact, there's been a lot of research to show the higher your level of IQ or level of intelligence, the more likely you are to be blinded by your biases. And the reason being is that the more sophisticated you are at rationalizing why you came to a decision or a perception, the more likely you are to believe that that was based on factual information. And so the higher your level of intellect, the more you have the ability in terms of confirmation bias, confirming why that bias was accurate or why that decision was accurate. The other part of it is our view of self. Most of us view ourselves as being fair and equitable. And so that gets in the way of us actually also being aware of our biases. We would believe I would not discriminate, or I would never treat someone differently based on, demographical information or appearance and those types of things. And so we want to believe that we would treat people fairly. The thing about a bias is that your biases can play out and lead you to behaviors that are contrary to your whole value system as well, because they happen at an unconscious level. And I think, in terms of biases, there are 3 building blocks that I think are important for people to understand. Number 1 is the culture that you identify with. So your cultural lens is important. And a culture, I mean your attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs. And that impacts how you see the world and how you see others. And so when you see someone acting in a particular way, based on your cultural lens, you will determine whether you think that that behavior is appropriate or inappropriate. So that's the first building block. The second building block are stereotypes. And most people know what a stereotype is. It's when you have an experience with one person from a group, and then next time you see someone that you think belongs to that group, you attribute that experience to them or that perception to them. And stereotypes are interesting because they may not all be based on your own experience. They could be something that you've learned or heard as well. And the media plays a huge role in that. And then the third building block is the one that I mentioned, your sense of self and that level of intellect and how you would view yourself as being fair and equitable.
Well, that is fascinating. It really makes a lot of things in my life make sense. I saw a speaker about 15 years ago, very, very successful businessman, and he was talking about hiring a new vice president and that he brought this person in the room with him. They spoke for a half an hour. They never talked business. They never talked about the position. They just talked about sports for a half an hour, and he absolutely knew this was the guy for him, and he hired him on the spot. But if you look at this is the person I feel comfortable with. This is somebody that I've had success in the past. We come from the same cultural background. We have similar interests. That makes a lot of sense. So it's really about being aware that other people with different backgrounds may lend quite a bit to an organization. I want to shift the conversation now because there's a lot that's going on in the world. There's Me Too. There's a lot of legislation that's being considered in the world for LGBTQ rights. And as importantly, right now, Black Lives Matter movement, which also has been around a while. So this is all helping us rethink what we're doing in the world. And I think that there's some sweeping change that's coming. But why does this time feel different? The wake of civil unrest and protests around George Floyd and his death, why does it seem different today than it has in the past?
And it is very different. And I will tell you, as a diversity expert and consultant, over the last 6 weeks or 2 months almost, the interaction I've had with organizations has completely changed. The interesting thing about the George Floyd incident and Black Lives Matter and the impact that it has had, not just here domestically, but actually globally, is very interesting in how it's playing out in the workplace. I think what was different about this time with the George Floyd incident and Black Lives Matter, as you had stated, because Black Lives Matter has been around for a while, the different things, first of all, I think it was a perfect storm. There were a lot of different things that have happened at the time. Number one was technology and social media, which allowed the incident to be captured and then distributed across the world in a matter of seconds. I think the other part was that people had time, because of most of us during the pandemic, even globally, are locked down, and we have time to view the incident and numerous opportunities personally on our phones, on computers, and on television. And the other part I think that is really interesting was that as people viewed this incident, and from what I've heard from feedback from some of the organizations and the participants in my trainings, is that when they viewed this incident, what they saw was a man who was not resisting arrest, who was actually appeared to be complying with the authorities, to be handcuffed, put on his stomach in a very compromising position with 3 officers on his nailing on him, with one actually on his nailing on his neck. And they did not see him in any confrontational way. And then eventually he was pleading to breathe. And then I think it led to him pleading for his mother. And then his last words, he said, "I'm dead," and he died. And I think that incident, most people who viewed that felt that they could not come with a rationale of why this man had to die. Why did he have to die? And
Jocelyn,
so,
we have been talking about bias. I mean, it's occurring to me at this moment that what it did for so many people is it challenged their implicit bias, that someone who might die in police custody was for some reason accountable. They were resisting. They had done something terribly wrong. They had, and you have to challenge that. You saw with your own eyes that bias is not correct. You have to rethink what you just saw. And maybe now we have to rethink a lot of the things that we've seen in the workplace, in our culture, in stores, in families, whatever it is. So I meant to interrupt you, but I also wanted to just say, this is about implicit bias.
absolutely. And you're right. What that incident did was it level set and then allowed people to look at things differently from a whole different lens and a whole different perspective. And they re-examined some of the past incidents similar to George Floyd and some that have happened since. And then also it led to, inequities across different things, like you said, economic inequities, education, living, cost of living and housing, healthcare. And so people started looking at things from a different perspective, and it changed that vantage point. And then it created this kind of unity among diverse groups. And that's why I said it level set. And so when you look at the civil unrest and the protests, it was probably, in my experience, in my lifetime, the most diverse group of individuals coming from all walks of life, coming together and creating this form of unity and public empowerment. And I think because of the strength of that, it led to this empowerment that now has created this situation where people are now asking for a different level of commitment around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they're willing to hold organizations, companies, leaders accountable. And I think that that's the difference that we are feeling now in terms of where organizations are now saying we either have to commit or recommit to diversity and inclusion, and making sure that we are credible in that commitment and demonstrating that commitment.
So we can now challenge ourselves everywhere in our lives, including the workplace, to challenge this bias. This bias, perhaps we were wrong. And we've seen up close that we have been wrong. I think that was the light bulb. Now I see. And it also, I think, in conversations that I've had, have allowed for people to seek out more information and a greater understanding of what else they were wrong about. So that is I think the reason that we're seeing such a different mass unity around Black Lives Matter. Mapping this to leadership in companies, what do we have to do as leaders of companies to demonstrate a commitment to inclusion and diversity today?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think actions speak louder than words. And coming up with your action plan around how you're going to stand behind your commitment is really important. And that's what I really help organizations do. And I was doing that prior to even the new climate that we find ourselves in, is taking a strategic approach to diversity and inclusion. Diversity alone is not enough. It's inclusion that's really important. And so I think organizations have to do both of those. Most organizations really focus on the people aspect, diversity and representation. But now what we're finding is that if you don't have an inclusive culture that's equitable, that's where people want to hold organizations accountable. It's really easy to say we're going to diversify our board or we're going to diversify our leadership team. But if the culture isn't inclusive, then at the end of the day, are all your policies, practices equitable? And I think that that's important.
So do you have a very short anecdote of what is the most effective inclusive strategy you've seen go into effect in a real company?
I was in a leadership development program, and I'll try to be brief. I was in a leadership development program some time ago, and there were about 30 of us in that program. And out of the 30, there were 2 people of color, myself and another woman. And what we found when we had a break and we were just discussing with all of the participants in small groups, talking about how we got the current position that we had at the company, we found it was something really interesting happened organically. We found that the 2 of us, myself and the other woman of color, got the job traditionally, applying online. We saw a posting and jumped through all the hoops to get the interview and selected. What we found, everyone else that were not people of color got the position through someone they knew. Someone that worked at the company, put in a good word for them, helped their resume get to the top of the list, and that's how they got their job. And when I share that with organizations, particularly leadership, it's an eye-opening experience because most of them realize that's how they got their job, and the people of color realize that they had a different route. And so when you're talking about inclusion, you want to create a level playing field so that everyone has the same experience and the same level of opportunity.
That's a great place to end. Thank you so much for your story and for being here today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
This is Denise Policella. Today on Focus on Legal, we're going to discuss selling your business post-pandemic. Now, whether you've suffered financial losses or you've just decided this is a good time to move on, let's sell your business in the way that is the most profitable and least risky to you. Here are some tips. First, do an honest evaluation of your business. That won't include things like the sweat equity that you put into it, but it will include not just your net profits year over year, but things like intellectual property that you've developed, trade fixtures, customer list, goodwill, and your talent pool. Think about structuring and be flexible there. If you as a seller are going to insist that your buyer cashes you out at closing, you have to adjust your expectations down because you will not be getting the asking price that you want. Therefore, consider being flexible and allowing your buyer to finance. This will get you the most bang for your buck. Always engage an experienced business attorney to help you through this transaction. For the amount of money that you pay an attorney, you will reap the rewards on the back end by not having the risk associated with adverse or ambiguous contract language that could land you in court and cost you money a year from now or 2 years from now after the deal is done. Also, be sure to engage your CPA. There's a taxable event here, so make sure that your CPA is involved in the monetary decision. And finally, never ever do a handshake deal for the sale of your business. These transactions must be memorialized for your protection. So if you're dealing with a buyer who refuses to sign a written letter of intent, move on. They're not serious. Remember, always engage an attorney before making any moves, and good luck with your next endeavor.
Focus on Law, brought to you by Policella and Associates, PLLC. Focus on Tech, brought to you by Providence, making technology easier.
The executive producers of Focus on Business are looking for your stories. Stories from owners of established businesses that have come through amazing adversity, bucked the odds, found the next big thing. If you have a story, we want to hear from you. Go to our website and maybe we'll invite you onto the show.